Thursday, April 24th, 2026, Ottawa, 10:14 in the morning. The United States Commerce Secretary has just told a Senate committee that Canada's trade strategy is, quote, the worst he has ever heard. The U.S. Trade Representative has threatened retaliatory action unless Canadian provinces put American liquor back on store shelves. Donald Trump is sitting in Washington convinced that Canada is 10 weeks from cracking. And into all of that, into that pressure cooker, that wall of American noise, Mark Carney walked into a community housing event in a quiet neighborhood in the nation's capital and said 7 words that shattered the entire premise of Washington's strategy. I do not get up first thing in the morning and think about the United States. That line is already viral. You have probably seen the clip. What nobody is telling you is everything else that happened in that same room, in that same press conference, on that same morning. Because those 7 words were not a moment of passion. They were the closing argument of a case that Carney had spent 2 hours building, brick by brick, fact by fact, legal point by legal point. By the time this is done, you will understand not just what he said, but why it works. And more importantly, you will understand what it means for your job, your mortgage, the price of groceries on your shelf, and the future of the biggest trade agreement in North American history. There is a family I want you to keep in mind throughout this. Call them the Pelletiers. They live in Windsor, Ontario. One works in auto parts assembly. One works in a primary school. They own a modest home, bought in 2022. Their mortgage renewed this spring at a rate 3 points higher than the one they locked in 4 years ago. They are not economists. They are not following the CUSMA review schedule. But everything we are about to discuss lands directly in their lives. Their paycheck, their job security, the cost of everything in their cart. The Pelletiers are who Carney said he wakes up thinking about. Let us find out if the math backs that up. We know what happened in that press conference because it was broadcast live and because 3 separate Canadian political journalists who cover the PMO filed detailed accounts within the hour. We have the full transcript. We have the video. We have the Congressional Committee records from Washington the same morning, where Lutnick and Greer were testifying. We have the Bank of Canada's own assessment of what happens if CUSMA goes sideways. We have the IMF's formal ranking of Canada's fiscal position among G7 nations, published just days before this press conference. And we have the legal text of CUSMA Article 34.7, the Sunset Clause, which is the document that nobody in mainstream media is bothering to explain, even though it is the legal foundation underneath everything Carney said. This is not commentary, this is the documentation. Let us go through it. Picture the room. It is a community housing site in Ottawa, not Parliament Hill, not a war room, not a trade summit. Folding chairs, insulation board, the smell of fresh concrete. Carney arrives in a dark suit, announces that 10,000 new homes are going into the ground across Canada through the Build Canada Homes program. He announces a saving of up to $158,000 per Ottawa home buyer through the combined GST elimination and municipal development charge cuts. He announces 118 units of new geothermal housing right here in this neighborhood, cutting the long-term energy costs for every single resident permanently. The housing announcement takes 15 minutes. Then he turns to the reporters. And the first question out of the gate is not about housing. It is about Washington. A journalist says, "The Americans are telling me this is not really a negotiation. They are laying out what they need Canada to do. Canada is not meeting them there. What is your plan?" Watch what Carney does not do. He does not get defensive. He does not pivot. He does not reach for talking points. He pauses, looks directly at the reporter and says, "That is a negotiation. That is a position. There are two parties in a negotiation. We are not sitting here taking notes and taking instruction from the United States." That sentence hits like a technical foul, because what Carney just did was not emotional. It was surgical. The United States has spent months trying to frame the CUSMA review as a one-way demand process. You present your grievances, Canada concedes, Washington approves. Carney publicly refused that framing, on the record, in front of every national media outlet in the country. He did not say we disagree. He said the premise is wrong. There is a difference. And anyone who has ever sat at a negotiating table knows the difference matters enormously. Then he listed what Canada was doing while this pressure was mounting. Second fastest growing economy in the G7. Wages growing at twice the rate of inflation. 20 new trade deals signed on 4 separate continents. The strongest fiscal position among G7 nations, confirmed by the IMF just days earlier. A net debt to GDP ratio of 43%, compared to near 100% for most of its peers. He was not bragging, he was filing evidence. And the evidence said, we are not a country that needs to make a desperate deal. Here is the first receipt, and it reframes everything the Americans have been selling. Receipt 1. Canada is not desperate. Washington has built its entire strategy on the assumption that it is. The U.S. Commerce Secretary went on record calling Canada's trade strategy, specifically the idea that Canada can afford to wait, the worst strategy he has ever heard. They suck, Lutnick said at the Semaphore World Economy Summit. We are a $30 trillion economy. That is the framing. Big America, small Canada. Canada needs this deal more than we do. Except the IMF just ranked Canada's fiscal position as the strongest in the G7. Canada's net debt to GDP ratio of 43% puts it in a completely different fiscal universe than the United States, which is running near 100%. Canada signed 20 new bilateral trade deals in the past 12 months across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The UAE committed $70 billion in investment into Canada. Canada's corporate tax rate sits 4 points below the American rate, even after Trump's big, beautiful tax bill passed. In plain terms, Canada has more economic runway than Washington wants to admit. And when a country has runway, the party that blinks first is the one that actually cannot afford to wait. But that is only part of it. Receipt 2. The July 1st deadline is a pressure weapon, and Carney just diffused it. The Trump administration has built 12 months of pressure around one date, July 1st, 2026. The CUSMA review deadline, the date by which, according to American officials, Canada must come to the table with concessions or face consequences. But here is what the legal text actually says. Under Article 34.7 of CUSMA, July 1st is a review checkpoint, not a cliff, not an expiry, not an ultimatum. If no consensus is reached to extend the agreement by 16 years, the deal does not collapse. It shifts to annual reviews. The agreement itself stays in force until 2036. Canada's own chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, said it publicly. July 1st is a checkpoint, not a cliff. Trade lawyers at Cassidy Levy Kent confirmed it. The agreement will not expire in July. That is not how this works. So the entire psychological pressure campaign Act now or lose everything, is built on a legal misreading that the Americans either do not know or are hoping Canadians will not look up. Carney looked it up. And on Thursday morning, in a housing site in Ottawa, he communicated the answer. We are also ready to wait. 5 words, built on a legal foundation most people missed. Think about what this means for the Pelletiers in Windsor. Her husband's job in auto parts depends on the CUSMA rules of origin, the provisions that allow Canadian-made components to cross the border duty-free. Those provisions do not disappear in July. They remain in force until 2036 at the earliest. So when American officials imply that Canada's window is closing, they are not describing a legal reality. They are describing a negotiating tactic. And right now, Mark Carney is the only person in the room who is saying that out loud. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think the July 1st deadline is a genuine turning point or a manufactured pressure tool? I want to know what you think happens next. Receipt 3. The alcohol dispute is not the story. The tariff violations are. American officials spent 2 days this week making the provincial alcohol bans the centerpiece of their public complaints. Howard Lutnick called it outrageous. Jameson Greer called it a trade barrier. Reporters framed it as Canada's biggest irritant. And then Carney flipped the entire frame. A reporter asked, "What if the alcohol issue becomes more than an irritant?" And Carney did not apologize. He did not promise to fix it. He said, "You want to talk about irritants? 50% tariff on steel, 50% tariff on aluminum, 25% tariff on automobiles, all the tariffs on forest products. Those are more than irritants. Those are violations of our trade deal. Not grievances, not complaints, violations. Legal violations of an agreement that the United States itself negotiated, signed, and championed. This is the distinction that every other outlet buried. Canada is not complaining that the tariffs feel unfair. Canada is building a legal argument that the tariffs are illegal under existing binding international trade law. Violations can be challenged. They can be ruled upon. They can be remedied through dispute mechanisms built into the very agreement the Americans say they want to review. Carney is not venting. He is filing a case. Receipt 4. The Mexico comparison cuts both ways, and Canada knows it. The pressure to move fast intensified this week because Mexico entered formal bilateral negotiations with the United States. U.S. Trade Representative Greer met with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum on Monday. A joint statement confirmed that an official bilateral negotiating round between the U.S. and Mexico will take place in late May. Canada has no such date set. The implication from Washington is that Canada is falling behind. The counter reading, the one Carney's team is operating on, is more precise. Mexico had a longer list of issues to resolve, a different set of structural vulnerabilities, and a different political moment. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, said it directly. If we wanted to accept a bad deal, we could have done that months ago. Canada is not racing Mexico. Canada is waiting for an outline of a deal that is actually in Canada's interest. Those are fundamentally different objectives, and one of them produces a bad deal for a decade. The other one produces leverage. Here is what every other outlet is missing, and I mean every single one. The conversation on Thursday was not really about alcohol bans or steel tariffs or July deadlines. Those are the surface. The thing underneath, the thing that changes the entire strategic picture, is a legal architecture that most Canadians have never heard of, and most American officials are counting on Canadians not understanding. Let me translate it for you. CUSMA Article 34.7 is the Sunset and Review Clause. It was inserted into the agreement at U.S. insistence. The Americans wanted a mechanism to revisit and renegotiate the deal every few years without having to formally withdraw. What they got was a review checkpoint in year 6. But the thing they did not fully plan for is that the checkpoint cuts both ways. Canada can sit at that table and say, "We reviewed it. We found violations. We want remedies before we discuss extensions." That is not obstruction. That is the legal process the Americans built. Carney turning the tariffs into treaty violations is not just rhetorical. It is laying the procedural groundwork to use the review mechanism as a remedies forum rather than a concessions forum. In plain language, the Americans built a door so they could push Canada through it. Carney just grabbed the handle from the other side. Now let us go one level deeper, because this is where the real story lives. What you are about to understand is the psychological architecture underneath the surface diplomacy, and why the specific words Carney chose on Thursday are more strategically calculated than anything else said in this trade dispute in the past year. Move 1. Carney is operating from the principle that the party willing to walk away holds the power. Trump wrote about this in The Art of the Deal. It is not a secret doctrine. It is the foundational logic of every high-stakes negotiation. The side that needs the deal more caves first. For 12 months, Washington has operated on the assumption that Canada cannot afford to walk away. And for 12 months, that assumption has gone largely unchallenged in public. On Thursday, Carney challenged it. We are ready to wait. That is not defiance. That is the declaration of a party that has run the numbers, assessed the alternatives, and concluded it can survive the timeline. In plain language, if you genuinely do not need the deal on their timetable, you win the negotiation even before it begins. Move 2. Notice what Carney did not do. He did not offer a counterproposal on alcohol. He did not signal flexibility on dairy. He did not name a date for formal talks to begin. Every other press conference in the last 6 months has contained at least one of those softening gestures. Something to give Washington a face-saving off-ramp. Something to keep the relationship warm. Thursday had none of it. He announced housing. He listed Canada's economic strength. He turned the tariffs into treaty violations. And then he said he wakes up thinking about Canadians, not about the United States. The absence of the softening gesture is the signal. It means Canada has reached the phase of the negotiation where it believes that patience, not concession, is the correct strategic posture. What that actually tells you is that Carney's team believes the political pressure on Washington is building faster than the economic pressure on Ottawa. Move 3. The housing announcement was not a backdrop, it was a message. Carney stood in front of 10,000 new homes, affordable homes, geothermal homes, homes for the family that cannot make rent. And he used that setting deliberately. Because the domestic political narrative in Canada right now is affordability. The election was won on affordability. The mandate is affordability. And Carney is governing from that mandate while simultaneously running a trade war. What that communicates to Washington is something Trump's team has consistently underestimated. Carney has a domestic base that is not watching this trade war nervously. It is watching it with defiance. Canadians are boycotting American goods, canceling American vacations, choosing domestic over imported. voluntarily, enthusiastically, at scale. Cross-border Canadian tourism to the United States fell 30% last year, as Senator Shaheen of New Hampshire told Lutnick directly to his face in committee on Wednesday. In plain language, the political wind in Canada is not blowing toward concession. It is blowing toward exactly the kind of patience Carney is performing. The historical analogy that applies here is not the art of the deal. It is the Reykjavik summit of 1986, when Ronald Reagan walked away from a near-total nuclear disarmament deal because Mikhail Gorbachev demanded the U.S. abandon its missile defense research. Every advisor in the room said Reagan should take the deal. Reagan said no and walked out. 3 years later, the Soviet Union came back with a better offer. The party willing to absorb the cost of walking away won the next table. Call it the Reykjavik Doctrine. Genuine indifference to a deadline is the strongest negotiating weapon available to a party that has run the math. Carney just put that doctrine on the record. Now, to be completely fair, the counter-argument deserves to be made seriously because it is serious. The critics, including some within Canada's own conservative opposition, argue that patience is not strategy. It is passivity dressed up in confident language. Pierre Poilievre said this week that Carney has already squandered Canada's leverage. The argument goes, while Canada waits, Mexico is entering formal talks. While Canada holds, the Americans are defining the negotiating agenda: automotive rules of origin, dairy, digital services tax, and Canada is letting those definitions harden without Canadian input. Every week that passes without a formal negotiating round is a week the Americans spend shaping the terms of the eventual deal. Ready to wait is not the same as ready to win. That is not a weak argument. The counter-evidence is procedural rather than emotional. Canada is not absent from the process. Trade Minister LeBlanc has had continuous informal contact with both Lutnick and Greer. Canada assembled a bipartisan advisory council this week, including former Conservative leaders and cabinet ministers, specifically to ensure that no single political perspective is missing from the strategy. Dairy concessions are explicitly off the table, and that position is publicly stated and has not moved. The outline of what Canada needs is clear. What Canada is waiting for is evidence that the Americans are prepared to provide it. That is a rational condition. It is not passivity. But the critics are right about one thing. The window for patience has a political half-life, and that clock is running. Bring it back to where we started. Bring it back to the Peltiers in Windsor. In the next 90 days, two scenarios play out. Either formal CUSMA negotiations begin in a framework that Canada shapes from a position of documented strength, legal violations on the table, economic data in the file, bipartisan counsel in place, and the Peltiers keep their paychecks, their assembly line keeps running, and the mortgage that renewed this spring at least has a stable base to sit on. Or the July 1st checkpoint passes without a consensus on extension, the deal shifts to annual reviews, and the uncertainty that the Bank of Canada has already warned about, reduced investment, supply chain hesitation, hiring freezes, begins to land in communities like Windsor in a way that is felt before it is measured. The Bank of Canada said it plainly. Prolonged uncertainty in CUSMA would weaken exports, reduce investment and hiring, and push prices higher. That is not speculation. That is the institution that sets the interest rate that determines the Peltier's mortgage payment. The thing nobody says out loud is this. The Peltiers are not waiting for a press conference. They are waiting for the thing that comes after the press conference, the actual agreement, or the actual collapse, or the actual years of grinding annual reviews that produce neither. Carney's mourning does not begin with the United States, but their mourning begins with a mortgage statement and a payslip. And whatever gets decided in the next 10 weeks lands in that statement. That is the real stakes, not the headline, not the viral clip, the mortgage, the payslip, the assembly line. What Carney did on Thursday was build a legal, economic, and psychological case designed to change the terms of the negotiation before the negotiation formally begins. It was not a press conference. It was an opening statement. And it was delivered not in a courtroom or a trade forum, but in front of a housing development in Ottawa, surrounded by the physical evidence of a government that believes its first obligation is to the people living inside those walls. The silence underneath Carney's 7 words is the loudest part. The Americans have said plenty. They have called Canada's strategy the worst they have ever heard. They have called the alcohol ban outrageous. They have implied that Canada is running out of time. And Carney looked at all of that, paused, and said, I wake up thinking about Canadians, not you, not this, them. That is not a line. That is a policy. And it is built on math, not sentiment. If this breakdown gave you something the clips could not, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next development in this story does not come with a warning. It comes as a number in a budget, a date in a press release, a sentence in a legal filing. And this channel reads those sentences before they become headlines. Here is your question for the comments. Is Canada's patience a genuine strategic advantage built on fiscal strength and legal architecture? Or is it a performance of confidence that will cost ordinary workers when the bill comes due? Drop an A or a B, because both answers are defensible, and I want to know which one you are living.